sorry I couldn't be with you today, but I'm excited to present remotely. So today I'm talking about individual and embodied encounters, visitor engagement with medical museum objects. So looking at medical museum practice and the significance of engagement with these objects, trying to better understand what is happening in these museums and to incorporate that more with museum studies literature. And I just also want to mention I will be sharing some descriptions of surgical procedures and pictures of surgical tools, but I will not be showing any images of actual surgery, of human remains, or of human bodies, just to give you a sense of what's coming so you can adjust as need be. One way I've tried to bring together medical museum practice and broader museum studies is to look at the histories of these institutions. So thinking about the development of museums in the 19th and 20th century, this idea of a public museum as an educational institution, sort of an edifying institution for the public, and as authoritative, that they're commuting in one direction with the public, and the public is sort of more passive participants. And you get medical museums following this pattern in many ways, opening in the 19th and early 20th century, trying to be educational institutions. But then there's concerns about how the public is reacting to their collections, specifically human remains. Samuel Alberti talks about this in the context of pathology museums and his history of these collections. And so that actually leads to the restriction of access to these collections. Unlike other museums at this time, which are increasingly becoming more open to the public, medical museums start to restrict access over concerns about sort of improper behavior or that visitors are getting the wrong kinds of lessons or the wrong kinds of things from engaging with these collections. By the later 20th century, museums are generally more comfortable with emotions and seeing audiences as co-creators of meaning in a variety of ways. And that also parallels medical museums shifting more towards a general audience and opening more to the general public. Some of this is due to them being less necessary as educational institutions, but it's also just a different sense of what these museums may be for, perhaps. So again, considering this history in a broader context. And then there's increased interest and investment in medical museums through the 21st century, what you see with more of these institutions opening, as well as things like the big investment and redesign in the Surgeons' Hall museums in Edinburgh, as well as, for example, the Science Museum in London and their medical gallery. So we're seeing more interest and investment in these spaces. So as museums have more embraced audience engagement in a variety of ways, they've also changed how they approach engagement with objects, including things like object handling. There's also been a lot of research on the well-being potential, the healing potential of engaging with museum objects, including things like object handling sessions in hospitals, for example. So some of that literature is cited here. But these studies don't really focus on the kinds of objects and the specific significance of them. For example, mentioning they pull from Egyptology collections or archaeology collections, but not specifically describing what objects they work with, the materiality, the context, and things like that. So I'm trying to understand this better in the context of medical collections. There's been a little more work around this in pathology collections, but I'm especially interested in medical tools. How do visitors engage with them? How does the public understand these objects that are meant to work on human bodies, right? Specific kind of engagement and understanding. And considering the range of perspectives, are people reacting as patients or as practitioners? In what ways does engaging with these objects have personal significance, helping people, for example, process their own experiences or the experiences of others? And what does this mean about the power and potential of medical collections? And of course, a lot of this will be familiar to you through your work as people who work with medical museums and collections. So I know I'm not breaking entirely new ground here, and a lot of my research has been trying to better understand this practice on the ground. So talking to medical museum professionals, doing a series of interviews there, also trying to collect data from visitors and trying to understand their responses. So trying to bring together a little bit this museum theory and current museum practice, specifically in the context of medical museums. Just two examples here from my partner institution. So the one on the left is a mask from about 1980. So something that a lot of people would still be familiar with today. These masks that were typically made of thick black rubber before medical clear plastic was common. And this came up a lot in my interviews with the Anesthesia Heritage Center staff, that masks are a particularly evocative object in their collection and people have a very strong reaction to them. But in the particular context of this one, a lot of people mentioned the smell because it was unusual and distinctive and something that's really stuck with them. So it's not always necessarily an upsetting aspect of the object, but it is something very distinct and visceral that really stuck with people. It smelled like rubber, right? And that can help maybe connect them to the broader experience of that medical treatment, of that context in their life. On the right, I have an example of a 19th century surgical kit, which is a relatively common kind of object in medical museums. And thinking about how it's evocative in different ways and which objects really jump out to people. Of course, the blades and the saws are sort of an obvious one. You see that amputation saw in front. But I want to highlight a couple objects too to think about how the context can shape our understandings. So one is the small brush. You can see it over there on the left. And the catalog specifically mentions the function of this brush as to clear away bone chips from trepanation wounds or from surgical saws. So while the brush itself might not seem evocative, understanding this context really gives you a visceral sense of the sort of realities of these surgeries that could really be powerful. Another example is the two long Liston-style amputation knives. The catalog mentions that one of them, the blade is worn away about 1.5 millimeters from repeated use. So here we're seeing how repeated interaction with the human body has actually worn away the metal of this tool. And that evidence of use can be incredibly powerful to witness because it really makes you think about the human bodies on the other end of that blade. And last example here, I want to highlight the tracheotomy tube. That's on the top, that little silver curve. And I highlight this just to show the personal nature of this as well. I had a severe infection many years ago, and I had a tracheostomy as part of that. So I have a strong reaction to that tube because it connects to my personal experience. Others may not have that reaction at all. But that's also part of the challenge of these collections, is these reactions are going to be so individual based on our own experiences that they're very hard to predict and to control for. And so that's an interesting challenge and also sort of an exciting opportunity in these collections that we never quite know how an audience is going to react to them, but we do know that it can be very powerful and very meaningful. So one tool that we developed to try to understand visitor responses was these comment cards, and these were developed in conjunction with the old operating theater, and a lot of these words were selected to meet their own assessment goals. So it's based on sort of a pre-existing scale that have been used in other research, but they changed a lot of the words to match their assessment goals. And we wanted to leave it open-ended so visitors could select multiple words. We could hopefully get a sense of the nuance of different visits and engagement. And then on the back, we left it open-ended so people could leave whatever kinds of responses they wanted. Just a brief summary of the responses. So about 25% of visitors left comments, and you also see certain words came out as the most common responses. So knowledgeable, far and away, speaking to the educational purpose of these museums, right? Common understanding of what museums are for. I also want to highlight, though, unsettled as the only negative word that was one of the more selected words. And I think it speaks to how these apparently negative aspects of a visit can happen alongside the positive ones and all kind of work together. So just a few examples of how specific objects or parts of the museum were reflected in these comment cards. So here we have one visitor indicating specifically the tools made them feel anxious. Someone else indicating the images of operations made them feel anxious, worried, and unsettled. But these are both indicated alongside words like welcomed, knowledgeable, captivated. So clearly we see that these more apparently negative aspects of the visit aren't necessarily overriding the positive, that these are all happening together. And perhaps these strong reactions to these images or the tools is connected to them feeling knowledgeable or them feeling captivated. So thinking about the power of these collections, and this helps gives us a little bit of insight, although of course limited still, but understanding a little bit better how people are reacting to these tools. And then this last one is an interesting example of a sort of personal kind of reflection. Someone says, "Thank God for modern medicine and epidurals. Don't fancy the cervix dilator." So they don't say, but it's likely this is someone who has given birth, and they're reflecting on their own experience, it seems like, in the context of this historical medical object. As a museum connected to a medical organization, the Anesthesia Heritage Center presents an interesting opportunity to better understand how medical professionals engage with these collections, as that's a large portion of its visitor base. So in 2024, the curator took several objects to the Trainee Anesthetist Conference to try to understand how these medical professionals early in their career would react to and understand these objects. It's also an interesting example because several of these objects, including the two I'm going to highlight here, tracheostomy tube and pulse oximeter, are more modern medical objects. They don't look historical, and they look like something you might see in a current hospital. But they're still part of these museum collections and still something to consider in the power of these collections. So here we have examples of responses to these objects, those related to the pulse oximeter in blue, to the tracheostomy in pink. These were written by the curator based on her conversations, so they're sort of quick notes, but they can give you a sense of the range of these responses and all these interesting aspects coming up. So we have some responses related more to medical practice, thinking of, critical problem solving, for example, with a patient with a tracheostomy in place, as well as more perhaps relating to the patient experience. The tracheostomy people thinking about what the patient has gone through, or that it looks barbaric, looks maybe painful. With the pulse oximeter, again, we have this range of people feeling thoughtful, sad, proud, and connected. I'm thinking of the importance of this object, but also the limits of its use, right? So thoughtful that it doesn't work as well for all patients, specifically those with darker skin tones, or sad that it's not available to everyone in all contexts when it should be. Also, this interesting aspect of connected, that it brings team together, that everyone is checking it. So that's speaking to specific clinical practice, that this is a tool that everyone responsible for patient care perhaps is looking to at once, and that helps them feel connected. So again, this is a range of responses, and it's just sort of preliminary, but it's really showing how these objects really prompt reflection and thinking and can be very powerful for people in their own practice. So thinking about all these aspects of engagement and what this means for museum practice, Manon Perry speaks to this very well, that it's about encouraging deeper engagement with these risky materials and the histories they represent. It's not about removing them from display, but about thoughtful engagement with them and considering the real power that can have. I found useful frameworks in practice around archives, specifically trauma-informed frameworks based on the principles of safety, trust and transparency, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And through my research, choice has really come out as a key aspect, especially as linked to consent. So this came out in my interviews with museum professionals as something that shapes their practice. What are visitors agreeing to when they enter museums, and what do they expect to see? So that can give you maybe a certain sense of freedom or latitude in that they are entering a medical museum space. They're expecting to see these kinds of histories and objects. But Matthew, who opened this conference, you're all familiar with his work, he spoke about how, because many of the displays that he curates for the Tayside Medical Museum are in more public areas in the hospital or in a medical school, he's very thoughtful that people have not necessarily chosen to enter a medical museum space. They have not necessarily chosen to engage with these objects and with these histories, and so that shapes the kinds of objects he chooses and how he displays them. I recognize I don't have concrete answers for a lot of the questions I'm posing here, but I'm trying to highlight the particular power of medical museums and of their objects, and to better understand how visitors engage with them more broadly, and to really draw attention to the important work that is happening in medical museums. So I want to thank all of you for listening to this, and also for the work that you do as people who deal with these collections on a daily basis. So thank you for listening. And if you're interested in this project, a lot of this is still in flux as I'm writing up my dissertation. So if you want more information, you can find it on my website listed here. And also the last slide is a list of references, so I know that'll go by kind of fast, but I will post this presentation there so you can also access it there. So again, thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. List of references here, and thank you again.